Good point. Let's run down what we're going to be talking about tonight.
In a general sense, here's what we're going to be talking about. The first of the programs that we did on terror, and it should be said that with tonight's broadcast, as with the others, there will be strong areas of bleed over, so to speak, and that's an appropriate term given the deadly instincts of the people we're talking about. There will be a strong amount of bleed over from the various lines of demarcation that we have set out for the programs. Although the first part of our series was on the drug connections, the next three on the terror connections. In fact, the drug and terror connections are inseparable. We're distinguishing between them primarily for conceptual purposes because the working capital from the narcotics traffic engaged in by the members of our intelligence community, whom the Christic Institute have termed the secret team, has provided the working capital for the various machinations and skullduggery, which will occupy a large part of has occupied most of our attention in the three parts we've dealt with on terror. Now, in the second program, Radio Free America number 30, the first of our programs about terror, we talked about the Triple Wilson team. We've talked about them perhaps ad nauseum for some of our listeners. We've been focusing on them for years, and we've been focusing on them because not only are they one of the prime movers in American national security policy, but specifically the main focus, the main stock and trade of the Triple Wilson team has been the exportation of terror. Many of the terrorist groups and elements that have been invaded against so heavily by the Reagan administration have in fact been actively armed and trained and at times protected by this very administration. The scenario that we've introduced very often, and it will come home in a very big way this evening, is that of the Reichstag fire. Basically provocation, setting up an incident in order to discredit one's enemy and to serve, first of all, as a pretext for the restriction of civil liberties here at home and military adventurism abroad. One might take a look at our growing naval presence in the Persian Gulf to attest to how effective a policy that can be when properly executed. Now, the second, we left off with the Triple Wilson team in Radio Free America number 30. In our last program, Radio Free America number 31, we began focusing on the systematic use of terror as a strategic instrument by the elements of the secret team. We focused on what appears to have been a destabilization of the Carter regime almost from the very beginning. The Carter administration made a number of changes which were not pleasing to various members of the secret team. They withdrew their financial support from the mullahs in Iran. Previously, the CIA had paid a $400 million annual subsidy to the religious leaders in Iran to keep them off of the Shah's back. Members of the secret team were heavily involved with the security for the Shah. In addition, one of the people looming large in the background, namely Henry Kissinger, and his scion, in a sense, his financial scion, David Rockefeller, were very much involved with the Shah's economic situation. The Shah banked his enormous oil profits with Chase Manhattan Bank. We took a look at such things as the apparent deep sixing of the hostage. First of all, actually, we took a look, first of all, at what appeared to have been attempts to get the hostage crisis into effect in the first place. The bad advice given Jimmy Carter by David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger to bring the Shah to the country in the first place. It was well known that this would produce the hostage crisis. We then took a look at apparently successful attempts to sabotage the attempt to rescue the hostages in April of 1980. We then took a look at a deal cut to avoid what the Reagan team, or an apparent deal, I should say, cut to avoid what the Reagan team viewed as a possible October surprise, namely some sort of stratagem by Jimmy Carter in October of 1980 which would have gotten the hostages freed and thereby assured his re-election. It appears that members of the secret team, which were to move on into the Reagan administration, committed treason and deliberately negotiated with America's enemies in order to sabotage the political fortunes of the Carter administration. We left off the broadcast last time by taking a look at a contingency plan to set up martial law in the United States. This particular plan was known as Rex 84 and would have been put into effect during a number of possible scenarios. The possibility of a racial uprising in the United States, the possibility of widespread resistance to a foreign invasion in the United States, or the occurrence, one should say, or the arrival of large-scale terrorism in the United States. We're going to be picking up right with this broadcast where we left off with the other. Namely, we're going to begin taking a look once again at the Rex 84 martial law plan. Some of the things that involve, we're going to go review some material from the concluding portions of RFA 31. And for the bulk of the broadcast this evening, we're going to be taking a look at some very, very sinister connections between Oliver North and other members of what the Christic Institute termed the secret team, and many of the terrorist elements that figured so prominently in a number of the key terrorist incidents of the 1980s. In particular, in 1985, calendar year 1985, there were a series of terrorist incidents in the world which to a large extent dominated the news in this country and which whipped up military fervor, one might say, to a perhaps unprecedented level, at least in my memory. Many of these incidents, in fact most of the incidents from 1985, have some very disturbing connections to the far right in this country and to the members of the secret team. The question that we're going to be examining in the broadcast this evening is basically one which we have asked, perhaps rhetorically so, during past broadcasts, namely, were these terrorist incidents set up by the same ultra-right-wing elements who have connections with some of the people who pulled them off in order to justify any one of a number of different reactions, the ultimate one, of course, being the institution of Rex 84, the institution of martial law in the United States. And that's what we're going to be examining this evening. First, the martial law plan, and then some very, very disturbing connections between the people behind that plan and the people who perhaps could have touched it off under the right circumstances. And again, one more thing that should be reflected against the background of this plan is that as we take a look at the connections between people like Oliver North and other ultra-right-wingers and these terrorists, alleged left terrorists, or perhaps real, at least people whose sentiments are sincere, even if they're so duped and deluded that they feel incidents like that are the type of way to further their policy. One of the most disturbing aspects of the broadcast this evening are going to be overt Nazi elements who loom very large and around the fringes of many of these same incidents. We mention this because, as we will review, we looked at it in our last program, one of the most disturbing features of the Rex 84 martial law plan was to deputize ultra-right-wing paramilitary types, in other words, Ku Klux Klan and Nazi types, and to use them as official institutors, one might say, of American national security policy, namely the institution of martial law. And in light of some of the provisions of that martial law plan, in light of some of the people they were going to be getting to institute that plan, and in light of the overt Nazi elements lurking around the edges of many of the ostensible left-wing terrorist incidents of recent years, again, the question we're asking is, are we dealing with a new Reichstag scenario?
The first article, detailing in some depth the plan that Dave just alluded to, is from the San Jose Mercury News for July 5th, 1987. The article is headed North and the Secret Government, subheaded Martial Law Plan Among Work of Reagan Advisors. The article is by Alfonso Ciardi, who's been doing excellent work, one of the few mainstream journalists who's been really putting out the good stuff on the Iran-Contra scandal. Alfonso Ciardi, who writes for the Miami Herald, but this is through the Mercury News Washington Bureau. Dateline Washington. Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North helped draft a plan in 1984 to impose martial law in the United States in event of an emergency, inspiring a sharp protest by then Attorney General William French Smith, according to government officials. The secret plan called for the suspension of the Constitution, turning control of the government over to the Federal Emergency Management Agency, appointment of military commanders to run state and local governments, and the declaration of martial law in the event of such a crisis as nuclear war, violent and widespread internal dissent, or national opposition to a U.S. military invasion abroad. North's involvement in a proposal to radically alter American government by executive order in a time of crisis is evidence that he was involved in a wide range of secret activities, foreign and domestic, far beyond the Iran-Contra affair, according to officials. The chief counsel of the Senate Iran-Contra Committee has declared in an unreleased memo that North was at the center of what amounted to, quote, a secret government within a government, unquote. Skipping down. The contingency plan was being written as part of an executive order or legislative package that Reagan would sign and hold within the National Security Council until such time as a severe crisis arose, an administration official said. It is not known whether Reagan signed the plan. Investigators now believe that from 1983 to 1986, North's office in the old Executive Office Building, adjacent to the White House, was the heart of an informal secret structure involved in far more than the sale of arms to Iran and the funding of the undercover war in Nicaragua. North's influence within that secret structure was so great, the sources said, that he was able to have the orbits of sophisticated surveillance satellites altered to follow Soviet ships around the world, call for the launching of high-flying spy aircraft on secret missions over Cuba and Nicaragua, and become involved in sensitive domestic activities. Some of Reagan's closest friends and advisors, including former National Security Advisor William Clark, the late CIA Director William Casey, and Attorney General Edwin Meese, were part of that informal secret structure, according to several congressional investigators and government officials. Skipping down. But according to the sources, the administration's propensity for secret activities may have had its beginnings in an October 1980 decision by Casey, then Reagan's campaign manager, to create a so-called October Surprise Group to monitor President Jimmy Carter's feverish negotiations with Iran for the release of 52 American hostages. The group, led by campaign foreign policy advisor Richard Allen, was founded out of concern that Carter might pull off an October surprise, such as a last-minute deal for release of the hostages before the November 4th election. One of the group's first acts was a meeting with a man who claimed to represent Iran and who offered to release the hostages to Reagan. Allen and another campaign aide, Lawrence Silberman, in April told the Miami Herald of the meeting and said that McFarlane, then a Senate Armed Services Committee aide, arranged and attended it. McFarlane later became Reagan's national security advisor, and in 1986 played a key role in the Iran-Contra affair. Allen and Silberman said the offer, which they said they rejected, was aimed at ensuring Reagan's victory. Congressional investigators now link another well-known campaign incident, the theft of confidential briefing materials from Carter's campaign before the October 28, 1980 Carter-Reagan debate, to the same secret group. The investigators now believe that Casey somehow obtained the materials used to brief Reagan on what Carter was likely to say and passed them to James Baker, another top Reagan campaign aide who in Reagan's first term served as White House Chief of Staff. Okay, so what we're talking about here, the plan, which as we'll see later came to be known as Rex 84, was a plan put together by, among other people, Oliver North, William Clark, Edwin Meese, and Bill Casey, the late Bill Casey, of course, who's not around anymore to talk about his part of the affair, and was planned to go into effect under a number of circumstances, but the most interesting for our purpose are the 1, widespread internal dissent, and B, specifically political opposition to an invasion by U.S. military forces. Again, the Reagan administration, being the kind of folks that they are, have learned some lessons, and one of the lessons they learned was how an outraged populace could gum up the works for a lovely military adventure like Vietnam. And the Reagan administration, if they were going to go to war with Nicaragua, was not going to have to put up with such irritations as dissent at home and the free expression of political opposition.
It's worth noting, too, because one of the things that we discussed at the end of Radio Free America number 30, our first program on the terror connections, was a plan. First of all, we talked about the Lepenka bombing itself, in which Aiden Pastora, who, although he was opposed to the Sandinistas, was equally opposed to the Contra factions themselves, primarily because of the fact that their leadership were all former Samosistas. And in large measure due to the fact that he refused to cooperate with the CIA, members of the secret team apparently set off a bomb. I say apparently because it has not yet been settled in American court, but they set off a bomb in an attempt to kill Aiden Pastora that was initially blamed on the Sandinistas and was being used as yet another piece of propaganda to make that regime look bad. One of the things that we spoke about also at the end of Radio Free America number 30 was a proposed plan by this same secret team to blow up the U.S. Embassy to Costa Rica, killing the United States ambassador to that country, Louis Tams, himself a collaborator with many members of the secret team, and then blaming that on the Sandinistas and using that as an excuse to invade Nicaragua. One of the things that emerged during the public hearings this past spring and summer was that Oliver North also had envisioned what he called an Alamo scenario, to get the Contras involved in a big battle where they would lose a lot of men, they would take heavy casualties, this again to instigate an overt U.S. military invasion of Nicaragua. Had there been widespread public opposition to that invasion, and there are strong indications that there would be, more than 70% of the population of this country opposes Contra aid, then the Oliver North scenario to institute martial law would have been placed in effect. Now, martial law and the Reagan administration are two things that are not strangers to one another. One of the things that we focused on in considerable measure in Radio Free America number 23 was the apparent deliberate use of terrorism when Ronald Reagan was governor of California in order to do just this sort of thing, to drive popular political sentiment to the right and to create a social and political environment conducive to the institution of police state tactics. Many of the terrorist incidents which plagued California under the Reagan administration, notably the Symbionese Liberation Army, appear to have in fact been put together by the national security establishment and the police in order to effect a right-wing takeover, if you will. Among the plans that were worked on by members of the Reagan gubernatorial administration, who later moved up into the Reagan presidential administration, was the Operation Cable Splicer and Operation Garden Plot, which were the California and national scenarios, respectively, for the institution of martial law in the United States in the event of widespread domestic disturbance. Many of the same people involved with the California plans moved up with Ronald Reagan into Washington, D.C., and were involved with the planning and possible execution of Rex 84. Rex 84 is the formal name for this martial law plan, and we're going to review some information that we presented in our last broadcast on the subject. This is the description of Rex 84 as it comes from the Sheehan Affidavit. The Sheehan Affidavit is Daniel Sheehan's affidavit, he being the point man at the present time for the Christic Institute, a public interest law firm who is filing suit on behalf of Tony Abergan and Martha Honey, the victim and wife of the victim from the Lepenka bombing. Reading now from the Sheehan Affidavit. At the end of March of 1984, I communicated to sources number 4, 5, and 6, and 7, the information communicated to me earlier in March by Protestant minister source number 1, and I asked them to ascertain for me the source of this accusation that the Catholic Church participants in the sanctuary movement were somehow involved in smuggling into the United States known communist terrorists, unquote, who planned to form themselves once inside the United States into military cadres to undertake the launching of military assaults against U.S. military installations, domestic communication centers, and domestic water resource systems, in the event that President Reagan deemed it necessary to initiate direct military action by U.S. forces in Central America, either in El Salvador or in Nicaragua. During the second week of April of 1984, I was informed by source number 4 that President Ronald Reagan had, on April 6 of 1984, issued National Security Decision Directive number 52, authorizing Federal Emergency Management Agency Director Louis O. Giuffrida, Giuffrida, and his deputy Frank Salcedo, Salcedo, to undertake a secret, nationwide readiness exercise codenamed Rex 84. This exercise was to test the readiness, unquote, of the Federal Emergency Management Agency to exercise civilian supervisory authority over Defense Department personnel, the personnel of all 50 state National Guard units, and numerous state-based State Defense Force units, which were to be established at the behest of FEMA by state legislative enactments, in the event that President Reagan chose to declare a, quote, a state of domestic national emergency concurrent with the launching of a direct United States military operation into Central America. This military operation was to be codenamed Operation Night Train. According to source number 4, the mission of the FEMA operation to be tested pursuant to this Rex 84 readiness exercise was twofold. First, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, after deputizing all Department of Defense personnel and State National Guard personnel, ostensibly so as to make such personnel civilians and to thereby avoid violating the congressionally enacted Posse Comitatus Act, would undertake to test its ability to seek out and to take into custody some 400,000 undocumented Central American aliens throughout the United States, and then to intern said Central American aliens in 10 military detention centers to be established during this Rex 84 readiness exercise at 10 U.S. military bases throughout the United States. I would take note there of the fact that there were to be 10 military bases and detention centers throughout the United States. We'll touch on that later. These documented Central American aliens were to be held at these detention centers during any real such presidentially deemed state of domestic national emergency without the right of habeas corpus until President Reagan declared the state of national emergency to be at an end. This second mission of the FEMA operation to be tested pursuant to this Rex 84 readiness exercise was the distribution by FEMA from U.S. military bases under the supervision of the United States Department of Defense through the State National Guard units down into the hands of the civilian, state legislature-created state defense forces of hundreds of tons of small arms and ammunition, ostensibly to be used by their civilian law enforcement deputies to enforce domestic laws during the pending of the presidentially declared state of national emergency.
Continuing a little further down in the Sheehan affidavit. During the third week of April of 1984, Source Number 7 obtained for me an introduction to Source 8, a member of the Legal Division of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the office headed up by FEMA General Counsel George Delt. Source 8, who was known by Source 7 to be an honest and trustworthy source of information based upon Source 7's direct experience with him, was shocked that I had such accurate information concerning the content of Presidential National Security Decision Directive Number 52. But he expressly confirmed the accuracy of the intelligence report given to me by Source 4 concerning the twofold mission of Rex 84. Source 8 expressed directly to me a high degree of fear and anxiety about the legality of what was being planned by FEMA General Counsel George Jett, FEMA Director Louis O. Giuffrida, and FEMA Deputy Director Frank Salcedo. Source 8 reported to me that he had never before seen inside FEMA such an intense level of security concerning any program. Source 8 reported to me that FEMA General Counsel George Jett had ordered the installation of a special metal security door into the hallway on the 5th floor of the FEMA building in Washington, D.C., behind which door all of the planning for Rex 84 was being conducted. Indeed, Source 8 reported to me that even long-standing employees of the Civil Defense Division of the Federal Executive Department, possessing the highest possible security clearances, were not being allowed through the newly installed metal security door on the 5th floor of the FEMA building to have access to the planning of Rex 84. Source 8 reported that only FEMA Director Louis O. Giuffrida, his Deputy Director Frank Salcedo, FEMA General Counsel George Jett, spelled J-E-T-T, and a few other men whom Source 8 noticed all wore a small red Christian cross or crucifix pin on the lapel of their suits, were even allowed through the metal security doors on the 5th floor of the FEMA building to have access to Rex 84. Through a source number 9, I was able to obtain a series of federal documents from inside FEMA, which tended to confirm the above reported description of the FEMA activities reported to me during April of 1984.
In early May of 1984, I was supplied by source number 4 with a number of documents describing in some detail a project supervised by then Special Assistant California State Attorney General Edwin Meese, codenamed Project Cable Splicer. This project, undertaken by Edwin Meese under the direction of then California Governor Ronald Reagan, took then California Organized Crime Training Institute Commandant Louis O. Giuffrida from his post in San Luis Obispo and made him the commanding general of the California State National Guard. At the California Organized Crime Training Institute, Commandant Louis Giuffrida had been the instructor in civil disorder control. As commanding general of the California State National Guard, Louis Giuffrida coordinated Project Cable Splicer for Special Assistant Attorney General Edwin Meese and Governor Ronald Reagan. Project Cable Splicer was a special war games readiness exercise pursuant to which Governor Reagan, Special Assistant Attorney General Edwin Meese, and California State National Guard Commander Giuffrida could, together, establish an effective state of statewide martial law, quote, in the event that forces of radical black nationalism joined forces inside the state of California with the anti-Vietnam forces to challenge the established authority of the state, unquote. Project Cable Splicer was part of a larger program codenamed Operation Garden Plot, which was a nationwide war game scenario prepared by then-President Richard M. Nixon and his Attorney General John Mitchell, designed to establish a nationwide state of martial law if Richard Nixon's political enemies required him to declare a state of national emergency. And in a section called State Defense Forces and a Guns for Contra scam, Sheehan continues, In mid-May of 1984, I was informed by source number 10, who is a professional journalist in New Orleans, Louisiana, that he had learned that the state legislatures of Louisiana, Alabama, and Texas had sometime around April 1984 or May of 1984 each passed legislation establishing units known as state defense forces, unquote. Source number 10 informed me that he was extremely concerned about this because the only people in Louisiana, Alabama, or Texas who seemed to have heard of the passage of these statutes and who were therefore signing up to join these state defense forces were ultra-right-wing paramilitary survivalist types or soldiers of fortune types who were being advised to sign up for these state defense force units at weekend survivalist training centers or ultra-right war game schools. Source number 10 informed me that this concern on his part had caused him to undertake an investigation to ascertain what was going on regarding the state defense force units in Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas. Source number 10 informed me that he had discovered that a group of men in Texas who had all signed up for the Texas units had been expelled by the Texas National Guard for being too radically right-wing. This investigation led him to a Louisiana State National Guard colonel, source number 11. Source number 10 informed me that this Louisiana State National Guard colonel had informed source number 10 that the State Defense Force unit in Louisiana was, in the near future, this being in May of 1984, going to be receiving a large quantity of small arms and ammunition in some kind of war game activity supervised by the federal government, but that the State Defense Force in Louisiana was only going to have to give back half of the arms and ammunition received in the war games. The half which were left with them were going to be smuggled out of the country to the Contras in Central America. Well, that, in a nutshell, is this Rex 84 readiness exercise, the martial law plan that was being readied by this administration. There are a number of chilling things about it. Simply the picture of men with a small red crucifix pin in their lapel, huddling together under circumstances so clandestine that not even the other members of the Federal Emergency Management Agency were permitted to be privy to their secrets, is chilling enough. The thought of taking Ku Klux Klansmen, Nazis, and types of that type, individuals of that type, and deputizing them, having them act in an official capacity as agents of the U.S. government, is chilling enough. It would be less chilling if it were not something which unfortunately had an all too clear precedent in the American past. One of the things we spoke about in our four-part series about the evolution of the American far right, which we called the Aryan nations, was in fact what we call the establishment of de facto Freikorps units in the United States, that we examined Ku Klux Klan and Nazi elements in this country in the past as operating as federal intelligence agents and police agents, and we speculated basically that many of the ultra-right-wing groups, such as elements of the Klan, the Nazi Party, the John Birch Society, were in fact operating as a Freikorps, as an underground extension of the U.S. national security establishment, in much the way that the organized murder gangs of the German army in the early 20s systematically eliminated the democratic leadership of Germany, paving the way for Hitler's rise to power. And at the conclusion of our four-part Aryan Nation series, at the end of Radio Free America number 13, we took a look at the Reagan administration as what we termed the ultimate exponent of Freikorps methodology, and specifically took a look at Oliver North and his use of elements of the World Anti-Communist League and other institutions, which could be described as explicitly fascist in order to further the aims of the U.S. national policy.
Indeed, and speaking a little bit more of Oliver North and his particular foreign policy aims and the aims of those like him, a well-written piece by Alexander Coburn appeared in These Times for July 22nd, 1987. This particular article was provided to us by Mae Brussel. The article is titled Homegrown Fascist. I believe it also appeared in some other publications, notably The Nation. Homegrown Fascist, Alexander Coburn. Oliver North is a true memento of the Reagan era, and indeed of the president himself. He has Reagan's own capacity for the vibrant lie, uttered with such conviction that it is evident that formidable psychic mechanisms of self-validation have in that instant convinced the liar, Reagan, North, that what he is saying is true. But on display last week in Congress was something more disturbing than a mere deceiver. The cocksure, edgy, ingratiating profile of an all-America 80s-style fascist. The fascist has absolute moral assurance that his lawlessness is lawful, that though he, quote, gets things done, he is following orders. that all impediments in his path, legal or moral, are obstructions erected by hostile conspiracy. Colonial wars are notable forcing beds for the development of the fascist personality, particularly if such wars end in defeat for the colonial or imperial power. France's defeats in Vietnam and Algeria enriched the already muscular tradition of Gallic fascism, and, in a different idiom, the U.S. defeat in Vietnam produced a crop of officers brooding on the, quote, stab in the back by effete civilians at home. It is entirely characteristic that North should have been part of the team drafting a secret plan to run the country by martial law. This phase of his activities occurred between 1982 and 1984, according to stories, particularly in Knight Ritter's papers, based on material developed by the Iran-Contra Committee staff. North's first assignment at the National Security Council in 1981 had been to carry the, quote, football, the briefcase carrying the plans for fighting a nuclear war that accompanies the president wherever he goes. Those who like thinking about the unthinkable might ponder this parable of impending nuclear disaster. A president who has frequently expressed the view that the, quote, apocalypse may occur, quote, in our lifetime, trailed by the football-carrying North with his own history of mental instability. In the following 2 years, North was the NSC's liaison with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, revising contingency plans to deal with nuclear war, insurrection, or major military mobilization. North and the FEMA folk settled down happily to develop scenarios of total control. FEMA's director at the time, Louis Giuffrida, had attended Army War College in Pennsylvania in 1970 and written there a paper advocating martial law in case of a national uprising by black militants, along with roundup and transfer to, quote, assembly centers or relocation camps, unquote, of at least 21 million American Negroes, unquote. This paper was reworked in a 1982 memo written by Giuffrida's deputy John Brinkerhoff, at which time North and the FEMA team developed their plan for a secret contingency order, turning control of the country over to FEMA at any time of nuclear war, violent dissent, or, most significantly, national opposition to a military invasion abroad. FEMA would supervise appointment of military commanders to run state and local government. In other words, while North's colleagues at the National Security Council were preparing the invasion of Nicaragua, North was working on a scheme to introduce martial law in the U.S. as a means of crushing any internal opposition to that invasion when it took place.
Now, one of the things that is most disturbing, obviously there are a lot of things that are disturbing about this contingency plan. The notion of interning 21 million black Americans in concentration camps, or, quote, relocation camps, as they have been euphemized since the time of Hitler, is certainly very ominous. Coburn refers to that in that particular column. Interestingly enough, the plan for rounding up a large portion, if not virtually all, of the black people in this country and interning them in concentration camps was left out of the July 5th San Jose Mercury News article by Alfonso Ciardi. Research credit on the following article goes to Mae Brussell once again. Mae obtained the original Miami Herald story from that upon which the Mercury story was ostensibly based. It was based on it, but regrettably the Mercury left out some of the most chilling parts. Once again, research credit to Mae Brussell. This is from the Miami Herald of Sunday, July 5th of 1987. It's by Alfonso Ciardi, and it's headlined, Reagan AIDS and the Secret... Reagan AIDS and the Secret Government. That's the title. And again, this is by Alfonso Ciardi. We're going to read the section of the original Miami Herald article, or part of the section, one of the sections that was left out by the San Jose Mercury. In the original Miami Herald article, the following information was printed that the Mercury did not print. Speaking of the Rex 84 martial law plan, the official said the contingency plan was written as part of an executive order or legislative package that Reagan would sign and hold within the NSC until a severe crisis arose. The martial law portions of the plan were outlined in a June 30th, 1982 memo by Giuffrida's Deputy for National Preparedness Programs, John Brinkerhoff, Brinkerhoff. A copy of the memo was obtained by the Herald. The scenario outlined in the Brinkerhoff memo resembled somewhat a paper Giuffrida had written in 1970 at the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, in which he advocated martial law in case of a national uprising by black militants. The paper also advocated the roundup and transfer to, quote, assembly centers or relocation camps, unquote, of at least 21 million American Negroes. Well, this, on these broadcasts, this is not a scenario that is entirely foreign to us. There is an archive program that we have placed available from archives on audio called the King Alfred Plan. If we've ever done a more controversial broadcast, I can't think of it. We're now going to go into the King Alfred Plan, unquote, and I think it would be worthwhile perhaps for me to explain a little bit about the background. In 1967, there was a novel published called The Man Who Cried I Am, authored by a man named John Williams. Incidentally, the hardcover edition was published, copyright 1967, by Little Brown and Company. Now, this book is a novel, although it's obviously a very realistic one. Near the end of the novel, a man, the protagonist, comes across a plan for the elimination of all black Americans in the event of just the sort of scenario we saw there, what they call a national emergency or an uprising by the minority, as they euphemize black Americans. The situation here. There was a plan outlined in this novel by the National Security Council to basically, it could be termed a final solution to the Negro problem, quote unquote. The plan for the interning and, reading between the lines, the elimination of all black Americans. Although the book itself is a novel, eventually the actual document, or a document called the King Alfred Plan, began to be circulated among certain researchers. The document is identical in every respect to the document published in the novel, except for a file number at the bottom of the second page. Also, the placing of a footnote in the actual document, the copy which has made its way to researchers, is placed differently than the document as portrayed in the hardbound edition. The softcover edition, which I don't have in front of me, did place the footnote in the same place. It should be noted that both the hardcover and softcover editions had this document over several different pages. The copy that made its way to researchers was on 2 long Xerox sheets. The network of personal associations that got this to us is one which we trust quite a bit. Mae Brussel, whose work is featured on this station and who has provided a lot of our research in the past, was the person who sent me this document. And I'll repeat some of the story about how this came to me. Among the many things that convinced us to go with this particular story was that when Mae sent me the King Alfred Plan, 2 copies were intercepted in the mail and never arrived at all. A third took the better part of 2 weeks to arrive from Carmel. And it just, for those of you who eventually hear this program outside of California, it does not take 2 weeks for a piece of mail to get from Carmel to San Jose.
You could jog from Carmel to San Jose in less than 2 weeks, yeah.
And I've handled a lot of correspondence with Mae, and Nip and I have gotten a lot of things through the mail. We had never received anything under such extraordinary conditions. Plus, Mae knew the person who provided her with this document very, very well, and the person assured her that, in fact, the King Alfred Plan was a real scenario. This was an actual copy of the document which John Williams put in his novel because the publisher would not allow him to say that this was a real document. Many researchers have taken us to task since for having, quote, been gullible, unquote. It should be noted that this is a real document. It is within the realm of possibility, and we acknowledge that this could be some sort of clever forgery issued by someone for whatever reason. However, the document itself appears to be real. I personally think that this is, in fact, the King Alfred Plan, that is in fact a real, the actual national security contingency plan for the elimination of black Americans. It should be noted later that after we put the King Alfred Plan archive show on file, one of our listeners on the East Coast, who's a computer whiz, obtained from a data bank an interesting document which would indicate, in fact, that the King Alfred Plan is, as it has been represented to us, and as Mae's confidant maintained it was, an actual copy of the National Security Contingency Plan. We're then going to read you this document, and then we're going to ruminate about Rex 84 in light of the King Alfred Plan.
The document obtained, not the King Alfred Plan itself, but the seemingly correlative document, is something that came out under the masthead of the Department of Rehabilitation and Correction for the state of Ohio. and it's publications not to be permitted in the institutions list for the Department of Corrections.
Might want to read them the actual case. This is pursuant to a law case. Just read them the case in the appendix for people who, that might be how it's referenced in the data bank.
Okay. It's the case is Taylor versus Perini, P-E-R-I-N-I, Taylor spelled T-A-Y-L-O-R. Taylor versus Perini, cite as 413F supplemental, I guess, SUPP period 189, dated 1976, Appendix E. And it's a document, Department of Rehabilitation's Corrections document, and it's headed Publications Not to be Permitted in the Institutions. And you go down and it's got a lot of things like a swinging publication called The Dawn of Aquarius and Black Dragon Fighting Society and all kinds of gay magazines and martial arts things and things of that sort, and some political things, Inez Garcia Defense Committee, a few other things like that. And then right down there, number 29, it says King Alfred dash National Security Council. Now, of course, this could just mean that the same document that we obtained is been floating around in the prison system, and that that still doesn't make it true, but it certainly means that it exists. It's not something that's been cobbled together to be sent just to researchers. It's around. It exists. The Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections is somewhat understandably concerned that prisoners in Ohio at least don't get their hands on it, sitting there in prison all day with nothing to think about except the fact that what the government might have in mind for them. So again, that is the a citation of it under the masthead of the Ohio Department of Corrections.
And again, the actual document which we obtained was identical in every respect to the document in the book, except for a file number at the bottom of the second page, mostly scratched out, which did not appear in the novel. Obviously, again, if someone for some reason was trying to establish a clever forgery, they could have stuck that on as well. However, again, from the network of personal associations, it is our belief that this is in fact a real document, and we're going to cite, well, we're going to talk about that some more in just a second. You want to stick something in there?
I'll wait till you finish.
The point being that, again, you know, it is within the realm of possibility for someone with the resources to have forged a very clever forgery. One wonders what the motivation might have been on the part of those interests. However, the main point is, and there are other indications that elements of our national security establishment would think along these lines, our work on Jonestown and other things would indicate that this is by no means a fantastic possibility. The fact of the matter is now, though, in contemplating the King Alfred Plan, that it is obvious that the subject matter of this memorandum, we believe it's real. Our confidants have told us it's real. Some might argue with that, but the fact of the matter is that the plan it details obviously is not only real, but is something which is very, very current. There is, in fact, as we now know from the disclosures of Rex 84 and the work of Alfonso Ciardi and others, there is, in fact, just such a contingency plan within the National Security Council. Something which is perhaps apocryphal under the circumstance, but we think is worth thinking about too, is that whether or not Rex 84, obviously Rex being the Latin word for king, could perhaps in some way relate to the King Alfred Plan. King Alfred having been a very famous king of England who's credited with having turned back the Norse invaders and helped establish certain principles of English common law. I'm now going to read you the King Alfred Plan, and I think it's worth noting a couple of things. First of all, take note of the constant reference to the emergency. Remember, this document, this contingency plan is by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and you will hear repeated references to the emergency as I read the King Alfred Plan. And this, again, is worth thinking about. And once again, just by way of covering our tails, it is within the realm of possibility that the actual document here is a forgery. We don't believe so. Our sources whom we trust have told us that, in fact, this is the real McCoy. It's just that it was too controversial for John Williams to come out and say, yes, this is a real document. But the fact of the matter is it is a real policy. And the point that we're making here is that it is now the job, we think, of responsible researchers to determine whether or not the King Alfred Plan is, in fact, the groundwork for Rex 84. Whether or not this is a real document, and we feel it is obviously a real policy, and that should scare the willies out of any sincerely patriotic American. We are now going to read you the King Alfred Plan. Deep-sixing, the apparent deep-sixing of the hostage. First of all, actually, we took a look, first of all, at what appeared to have been attempts to get the hostage crisis into effect in the first place. The bad advice given Jimmy Carter by David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger to bring the Shah to the country in the first place, it was well known that this would produce the hostage crisis. We then took a look at attempts, apparently successful attempts, to sabotage the attempt to rescue the hostages in April of 1980. We then took a look at a deal cut to avoid what the Reagan team, or an apparent deal, I should say, cut to avoid what the Reagan team viewed as a possible October surprise, namely some sort of stratagem by Jimmy Carter in October of 1980 which would have gotten the hostages freed and thereby assured his re-election. It appears that members of the secret team, which were to move on into the Reagan administration, committed treason and deliberately negotiated with America's enemies in order to sabotage the political fortunes of the Carter administration. We left off the broadcast last time by taking a look at a Turple Wilson team in Radio Free America number 30. In our last program, Radio Free America number 31, we began focusing on the systematic use of terror as a strategic instrument by the elements of the secret team. We focused on what appears to have been a destabilization of the Carter regime almost from the very beginning. The Carter administration made a number of changes which were not pleasing to various members of the secret team. They withdrew their financial support from the mullahs in Iran. Previously, the CIA had paid a $400 million annual subsidy to the religious leaders in Iran to keep them off of the Shah's back. Members of the secret team were heavily involved with the security for the Shah. In addition, one of the people looming large in the background, namely Henry Kissinger, and his scion, in a sense, his financial scion, David Rockefeller, were very much involved with the Shah's economic situation. The Shah banked his enormous oil profits with Chase Manhattan Bank. We took a look at such things as talked about the Turple Wilson team. We've talked about them perhaps ad nauseum for some of our listeners. We've been focusing on them for years, and we've been focusing on them because not only are they one of the prime movers in American national security policy, but specifically the main focus, the main stock and trade of the Turple Wilson team has been the exportation of terror. Many of the terrorist groups and elements that have been invaded against so heavily by the Reagan administration have in fact been actively armed and trained and at times protected by this very administration. The scenario that we've introduced very often, and it will come home in a very big way this evening, is that of the Reichstag fire. Basically provocation, setting up an incident in order to discredit one's enemy and to serve, first of all, as a pretext for the restriction of civil liberties here at home and military adventurism abroad. One might take a look at our growing naval presence in the Persian Gulf to attest to how effective a policy that can be when properly executed. Now, the second, we left off with a contingency plan to set up martial law in the United States. This particular plan was known as Rex 84 and would have been put into effect during a number of possible scenarios. The possibility of a racial uprising in the United States, the possibility of widespread resistance to a foreign invasion in the United States, or the occurrence, one should say, or the arrival of large-scale terrorism in the United States. We're going to be picking up right with this broadcast where we left off with the other. Namely, we're going to begin taking a look once again at the Rex 84 martial law plan. Some of the things that involve, we're going to go review some material from the concluding portions of RFA 31. And for the bulk of the broadcast this evening, we're going to be taking a look at some very, very sinister connections between Oliver North and other members of what the Christic Institute termed the secret team, and many of the terrorists and terrorist elements that figured so prominently in a number of the key...
Good point. Let's run down what we're going to be talking about tonight.
In a general sense, here's what we're going to be talking about. The first of the programs that we did on terror, and it should be said that with tonight's broadcast, as with the others, there will be strong areas of bleed over, so to speak, and that's an appropriate term given the deadly instincts of the people we're talking about. There will be a strong amount of bleed over from the various lines of demarcation that we have set out for the programs. Although the first part of our series was on the drug connections, the next three on the terror connections. In fact, the drug and terror connections are inseparable. We're distinguishing between them primarily for conceptual purposes because the working capital from the narcotics traffic engaged in by the members of our intelligence community, whom the Christic Institute have termed the secret team, has provided the working capital for the various machinations and skullduggery, which will occupy a large part of our, has occupied most of our attention in the 3 parts we've dealt with on terror. Now, in the second program, Radio Free America number 30, the first of our programs about terror, we talk